I am often asked, how do I get your job? How do I know what to do to get your job? So I'm going to tell you how I got the job, and the same process is going to apply to everyone. So let's go back to 1964. I was in high school in Roswell, New Mexico, and the kid in front of me in class leaned over to the kid next to him and said, "Hey, I might be a disc jockey at KRSY Radio." I went home, and I was living with my Aunt Ruth. I wish you could have met my Aunt Ruth. She was an overweight woman, very round. She was the absolute ruler of the house. Whatever Ruth said goes, but Ruth had a great personality. I was living with my Aunt Ruth because I had enjoyed going to Roswell High School, and my family wanted to move elsewhere, and I stayed with my Aunt Ruth so that I could finish out the 12th grade. And I told the story of what happened at school to my Aunt Ruth, and she pointed her finger into my face, and she said, "Bubba, you get in that shower and you get down there and you get that job." And that's what I did. I got the job at KRSY because they needed someone to be the disc jockey between midnight and 6 a.m. at this country station. And they paid minimum wage, which at the time was $1.25 an hour. That's how I learned to be a disc jockey. After doing that for about a year, I decided that I was going to get out of radio and go get a real job. So I quit. I loaded up my 56 Ford convertible that was about 10 years old, and I paid $250 for it. And I headed east out of Roswell toward Texas to eventually get to San Antonio, where I would live with my parents and go to school and learn a real job. I had in mind to learn how to repair TV sets. I had CB radio in my car at the time, which was civilized in those days. And as I was going through Brownfield, Texas, I called a guy that I had talked to on a previous trip through Brownfield. And another person came back to me and said that the person I was trying to call was out of town right now. Could he help me? Well, no, I'm just leaving my job in Roswell as a disc jockey at a country station there, headed to San Antonio. And the other guy came back and said, "Well, I'm the station manager for the radio station here in Brownfield. Why don't you stop and let me give you a tour?" I said, "I would love to, but I worked all night, packed half of the day, and got on the road. I haven't slept since yesterday, and I'm dirty from packing, and I'm just going to try to make it to San Antonio in one day." And as I was saying no, there was a loud boom. It was the right front tire of my 56 Ford convertible blowing up. Bam! Well, I was forced to accept his offer to help me. His name was Bob, and he and his program director, Don, same as my name, stopped and helped me. And they pushed my car into a gas station, and they said, "While it's being repaired, let me give you a tour of the station." So we went to the radio station. One thing led to another, and they wound up offering me a daytime job as a disc jockey there in Brownfield. They even had it arranged that I would live with a little old lady who would rent me a room for $25 a month. I said I would consider it and let them know. And they dropped me back off to my car. They paid the repair bill, and I was off to San Antonio. Well, by that time, the sun was going down. And as was a custom in those days, I picked up the CB radio and called around and started talking to a guy. And I asked him if he knew of a cheap motel there in his town, because I was about to fall asleep at the wheel. I was so tired. I said, but I have very little money, just barely enough to buy gas to get to San Antonio. So this motel has to be cheap. He says, I know just the people. He directed me to find him and then follow him to this motel. And he told me to wait outside. So he went in. A few minutes later, he came out and says, you're all set. Have a great trip. Thank you. And he left. So I went inside, and the motel clerk didn't know this guy from Adam. He simply paid for my room. What a great guy. I paid for my room, went to my room, and I slept for 14 hours. I was so exhausted. And then I resumed my trip to San Antonio, where after a day or two, I decided to take the job in Brownfield. On my return trip, I stopped in that same town to find that guy, thank him, and to pay him back. I found that he worked at a gas station, but he was not at the job that day. So I left an envelope addressed to him with a letter of many thanks and the money that he spent on the motel bill. Went on to Brownfield, Texas. Great job. I was daytime. I was really enjoying myself. After 17 radio stations, I decided I needed, again, to get a real job, and I answered an ad in Houston for IBM. I was one of 400 applicants, and they tested us for the better part of a day, and I was one of 40 chosen to work for IBM. The job, repairing Selectric typewriters. So I took the job at IBM, and I was sent to Lexington, Kentucky to go to school at the IBM factory. I lived in a rooming house, and one day the occupant of the apartment across from me knocked on my door. He worked at a local newspaper. And I think we had talked, and he knew that I had been a rock and roll disc jockey. I was in broadcasting. And he said that there was a movie company in town shooting a movie, and they challenged the radio and TV and newspaper people in Lexington to a softball game. And they were short a player, what I like to play. Absolutely, let's do it. Well, the movie company was shooting in a little town outside of Lexington, and it turned out that the pitcher was George C. Scott. Now, you have to be past a certain age to know who George C. Scott is. His biggest movie was the movie Patton, an outstanding actor of great renown. And as it turns out, he was the fanatic softball player. He was the pitcher, and I got up to bat, and oh my gosh, he delivered a ball underhanded that came by me so fast, I didn't react in time. And I was thinking, I'm going to show this actor. Well, I missed my first chance. Ball went by me a second time, faster than I could react. A third time, thinking, I'm on to you, I got a connection to the ball, but it went foul and caught, and I was out. So easy. By the way, the movie they were shooting was called The Flim Flam Man. 1966 was when it was shot. I finished the schooling in Lexington on the Selectric typewriter, and I was assigned to Austin, Texas, working for IBM, and my territory was UT, University of Texas, which included the tower where not long before that, a gunman had shot people from the top of that tower. But that was my territory. But then I got conned into going into the military. I got a call from Las Cruces, New Mexico, which was where I was living at the time. I had to register for the draft. And I was told that my draft notice was going out today, and he was doing me a favor by calling and letting me know that if I go join something before my draft notice gets there, then I can choose what I want to do in the military. Once my draft notice got to me, he explained, then you can't do that. So I joined the Army because it was 3 years, not 4 like the Navy or the Air Force. And I could choose my specialty, which I chose to be air defense radar repair. And so I joined the Army, and after a while I realized I never got a draft notice. The recruiters were just calling people and telling them that so they'll be alarmed and run down and join the military. They got me. So I joined the military and went to radar school, graduated second in my class of 450 guys, and my evil plan worked. I was sent to Germany. Got to Germany, and I was, after about a year, I was dating a woman who asked me one night if I would ever be required to go to Vietnam. Absolutely not. I'm set. I dropped her off, went back to my barracks, and walking up the stairwell, I passed another GI coming back down who said, "Hey, Smitty, I hear you're going to Vietnam." And he was right. A couple of weeks later, I left for Vietnam. Fortunately, they let you have a 1-month vacation between Germany and Vietnam. Got to Vietnam. I was in a compound in the Sarang Valley, a little ways in from the mid-coastal city of Quy Nhon. I survived more than 20 rocket attacks. And anyway, got out of Vietnam, got out of the Army. And what am I going to do? Well, first I called IBM because they owed me a job because I had to go in the military. They were required to give me a job. I called IBM in Austin, and the guy that I worked with before entering the military apologized that he didn't have a job open at the moment, but he was working on it because he recognized that he did owe me a job. He says, "Maybe I can get you into El Paso." And I said, "Well, I want to take a few months off after Vietnam, so this will work out just fine." So I took about 3 months off, called him back. I needed work, but he was not in the office. He was in New York. So I decided to call El Paso to see if anybody had heard anything there. But as an aside, let me tell you, I did not want to go to El Paso. The manager came on the phone, and when I introduced myself, he started screaming at me about how I was supposed to be there a week earlier. I tried to tell him that nobody said a word to me about being there, and that the job in El Paso was only one of a possibility, was only one of several possibilities. And he's screaming at me. Well, I hung up, and I was in San Angelo, Texas at that moment. So I just went downtown to a popular radio station, and they hired me as the morning disc jockey. And that's how I continued in broadcasting. So far, if you've been listening, I tried to get out of broadcasting and kept getting funneled back into broadcasting. So it was through a series of unfortunate events that I kept getting back into broadcasting. After that, I wound up living in Winter Park, Florida, and I went and looked for a radio job. I had no luck initially, but so I started selling cars for an income while I looked for broadcasting work. And again, I was funneled back into broadcasting, but in television. I'm sitting at the dealership, and I get a call from the news director at the NBC TV affiliate in Orlando. And he needed someone to anchor the 2 5-minute local newscasts within the Today Show. If you tune in the Today Show in New York at 7:25 and 8:25 Central Time, it could be a different time for your time zone. They have a local news break. I was hired to do that news break. Even though I had zero TV experience, I had only radio experience at that time. And in those days, this is 1970 in this case, the morning programming was not as important as prime time in the evening. So it was just me putting together 2 newscasts, running to the studio, sitting at the desk and doing the morning newscast by myself. Of course, there was a floor crew running the camera and whatever. And that's how I got into television. Well, that's not the end of this story. Believe it or not, after about a year, I decided I needed a full-time job because I didn't want to sell cars most of the day. So I went to the ABC affiliate and talked to the program director who had a slot on his floor crew for the live morning show. And I got the job of running camera for a live show that began at 6 a.m. every morning. And it's a good thing I'm a morning person. So that worked out well. Well, I worked there for a while, and then ABC decided to join CBS and NBC and have a morning show. And they created Good Morning America. Initially, it was called AM America. And so Cliff Pine was his name, the program director, called me in and said, "We're shutting down the live morning show, and you're the last person hired for the floor crew, so I've got to release you, but I like you. Can I place you somewhere else in the TV station? How about going to sales?" And I said, "I would rather be in the newsroom." Well, the following Monday, I was in the newsroom being sent out on a story, and I was sent with a reporter who showed me the ropes. We went to Kissimmee, south of Orlando, and shot a story. I shot it with a Bell & Howell wind-up film camera and went back to the studio. And that's how I got into television, as a reporter and anchor. They liked me on the air, and I was initially the weekend anchor, and I was also the substitute weekday anchor. And this is how I really scaled up my ability. Every day, we would go out in a 2-person crew. I shoot for you, you shoot for me. And we get back to the station, we throw the film into the soup, call it the soup, the film processing machine that could develop the film in a record 40 minutes. And then we would cut our own film and give the A roll and a B roll to the director. So one roll of film is the primary story. The second roll of film, the B roll, would be visuals. Like the A roll may be running an interview. The B roll will be brought up to show pictures of what the interview person is talking about. And so that's how I developed my shooting and editing skills. I was also a reporter. I developed my writing skills. I won 2 second place AP awards for writing investigative stories. Fast forward a few years, and I'm in San Antonio working at CBS TV affiliate, and a position came up for a new network called Satellite News Channel. I was the bureau chief, and it was my job to gather stories from stations in my area, Texas and 4 states that surrounded. My job also was to anchor 5 minutes out of every hour for my 4-state region. Well, just as things were getting good for us, SNC was sold to Ted Turner and turned into CNN Headline News. I was out of work. Well, it turns out that a good friend of mine, and again, here you go with an accident that gets me back into broadcasting, a good friend of mine who had been a chief cameraman at the CBS station had, through a friend, become a freelance cameraman for the 3 major networks in New York, NBC, CBS, and ABC. Whoever called him first on a breaking story from New York is who he worked for. All 3 of those networks have a bureau here in Dallas, Texas. So one day I'm sitting at my apartment after they sold SNC, rubbing my last 2 nickels together, when my friend called me and said that his sound tech had twisted an ankle. He's on a shoot in Dallas. Could I come up from San Antonio and be his sound man? Well, sure. Well, first of all, when I joined, his name is Joe Duncan. Joe Duncan and his wife, Patty, both of whom I worked with at the CBS station in San Antonio, are responsible for getting me into network news. Joe explained to me how much the job paid, and I was astounded. I got paid so much. I was astounded that I got my own hotel room. I got astounded that if I didn't get lunch, I get a penalty. I was just astounded by the money available to network freelancers. And that is how I got into network freelancing, which lasted many years until all the networks started running out of freelance money in 2009. And I finally got out of broadcasting and the video editor for 11 years at Texas Instruments. So that's it. And the point of this story is that when people say, how do I get your job? What do I need to do to learn what to do for your job? I tell them it does not matter whether you went to school for it or not, because you start out knowing nothing. And if you want a job in radio or television, you go to a small town and offer yourself at a small station where they're glad to have you for the cheap, and you learn the craft, whether it's radio or television. Then you build up a reel and you send it out to larger stations, and this is how you get work at larger and larger stations for more money with each step. It's the process that you'll have to go through regardless of whether you went to college or not. And it all depends on your dedication, your hard work, and what natural talent you might have for speaking on the radio or for reporting or for writing. But all of those skills you can polish at stations who will hire you for very little money, but it gives you a chance to get into the system and work the problems every day. So I counted that I worked at 17 radio stations when I was a rock and roll disc jockey in the 60s. So there it is. When you ask, how do I get your job? Here's a guideline that I just gave you. You can see my material at donsmith.tv. That's DONSMITH.TV, like television. And you can reach this podcast at themostexclusiveclub.com. I thank you for being in my audience today, and I'll see you on the next one.